this is almost 40 years later. This piece, I think, has some of the most commonly seen themes in Fred's work. Certainly the top 2/3 or so of the piece are flames, which I think among this group, I probably don't have to explain the significance of to a Holocaust survivor. They also shape a menorah, which is a really common piece seen in Fred's work. And in the center, sort of top third center of the piece, you see a series of circles. Circles have a lot of different meanings in Fred's work. Sometimes they represent wholeness, the womb, safety. Sometimes they can represent a sense of being stuck, of having no way out, nowhere to go. And I'll let you think about what they might mean to you in this particular piece. In the bottom center, you can, and you'll probably need to lean into your screen a little bit to see this, is a couple embracing and another face looking on from the side. Fred and Stella, his first wife, were in Terezin together for some time there, at least a few months. And I think spent a lot of that time stuck with others looking on, but also with each other, which is an amazing thing to have found. This next piece is the only one that we'll look at tonight that's not actually included in the book. I mentioned earlier that Fred's son Daniel took the photographs of most of the works that are in the book. This particular piece, we didn't physically have anymore by the time the book came out. And so Daniel wasn't able to photograph it. And as a result, you're getting, I think, my cell phone picture of it. So hopefully it still comes across, because I think it's too meaningful a piece to not have included. This piece is called Engraved Fields. And what Fred describes is a winter when it was much too cold to dig full enough graves for all of the bodies that were piling up in the camp. And so as the snow began to melt, the bones of those they had buried started floating back up to the surface. And this is what he remembers that looking like. One of the things that you'll notice about this piece is that there's a lot of texture to it. Small sticks, stones, and sand are pretty common in Fred's work. His very earliest art was largely created by using a stick to scratch out pictures in the dirt so that if a guard walked by, he could quickly kick more dirt over it. And the guard would not know what he had been doing. And sand, dirt, sticks, they continue to appear in a lot of his work, and to sort of call back to that. The first time Fred showed me one of his heavily textured pieces, he pulled it out and he just pulled his nails over it. It might have been one hanging on the wall. And Brian, my brother, Jesse, and I were all aghast. Like, you can't just treat art that way. And Fred said, well, no, not in a museum, but I know the quality of the work that I do, and I know nothing I can do is going to hurt it. And so texture really is a critical component to a lot of Fred's work, so much so that there was a series that he did where each color in a series of paintings was done with a different texture. And he was invited to do a show for the blind because they would be able to experience the artwork in the same way that somebody who could see would by touching it. Moving on to the next piece, which will be a bit of a change of pace. This is one of Fred's owls, and it's also one of his prints. Painting really became a form of mental health for Fred and for his first wife, Stella, both in a symbolic way of being able to get out the things that were in mind that he would dream about or would think about and needed to get out on paper rather than carrying with him, but also because there was a point where Stella became so sick that she was suicidal, and Fred was afraid to leave her home alone. And so he quit his full-time job to become a full-time artist because that was something he could do at home with her. And he created a mechanism for making prints together that took 4 hands, because you needed a hand on each corner to line the print up before pressing it. This is one of those. And part of what worked so well about that process was that it gave Fred and Stella something to do together each day. It gave them something to focus on. And at the end of the day, it also gave them something to sell, because bills were piling up and they needed a way to make a living. So they created some more commercial work that's maybe less symbolic of what Fred experienced and more, I'll leave it at that. One of this particular owl comes from a series that Fred did that started because he was in a gallery speaking with a gallery owner, and the owner got distracted by somebody else coming in, and his 3-year-old or so daughter was running around, and Fred called her over and said, "Hey, what's your favorite animal?" And she said, "Owls." So he drew her an owl, and she said, "Another one." So he drew her another one, and she said, "Another one." And by then the gallery owner was back and looking over his shoulder and said, "You can't give those to her. We're going to sell these." And he convinced Fred to create enough owls for an entire show, which sold out. And so they did another show, which sold out. And the gallery owner, of course, wanted to do a third show. And Fred said, "If I do a third show, I'm just going to become that guy who paints owls," and declined and went back to some of the work that was more meaningful to him. But nonetheless, a lot of his friends came to assume that it was Fred himself who really liked owls. And now Fred and Rebecca, his wife, have an entire wall in their dining room that's filled with owl memorabilia, pictures, stuffed animals, trinkets, things that people have gotten them over the years, in honor of his not, quite true love of owls. We'll look at one more piece together. This one is called Open Gates, and I'm actually going to read the description that's in Painting Resilience, because there's too much in here for me to try to remember and just talk about. Walls appear in many of Fred's paintings. Even though they're not always the focal point, they never fully vanish. He explains, "At some point in my work, I put gates in the walls so you could actually get somewhere. But then the gates started to look like the fences around the camps." Here, Fred paints the Temple Mount, a topic he returns to over and over throughout his career in different ways. In this version, streaming sunlight illuminates darkened archways. The short strokes are similar to the technique he uses in other paintings to create flames, but with this blue and yellow color scheme, they seem joyous instead of sinister. These arches symbolize different things at different times: new beginnings, tombstones, escape routes. This was just a sample of a few of Fred's works. He's created masks, stained glass for a few different synagogues, and thousands of other paintings and prints. Painting Resilience is not a complete catalog of his art by any means. I hope that at some point there will be a complete catalog of his art. I would certainly buy it. But the book itself is a way of learning more about his life through his artwork. And I hope that it does that reasonably well. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Fred to join me. And I'll start by asking him a few questions before we open it up to everyone else. And I'll encourage you, if there are questions that you're thinking about, to put them either in the chat window or direct them to moderator Ira Mayer, and he'll come on in a few minutes and share your questions with us. Hi, Fred.
Hi, Julia.
Good to see you. I think the thing that makes me more nervous than anything is talking about your artwork in front of you. So before anything else, is there anything I missed or anything you'd like to add to what I've shared?
I've painted so many things, and the theme running throughout it is that I'm painting my feelings, my attitude, my ideas. I do not illustrate, not that I couldn't, I just don't want to. That is, illustrate what is very, very vivid in my memory would upset me quite a bit. But what I do is put these same feelings, these same ideas onto a canvas. So for me, painting is a way of dealing with my difficulty, my emotional difficulties. There are many, but I've managed to live with them. So perhaps that is the theme of most of my work. How did I manage, in spite of what is in my head, in my memory, I have a way of dealing with it. Now, you look at a different painting, you'll see a different mood. Yes, there are many different ones, some of them very, very sad, some of them very difficult, but every now and then some joyful ones, as for instance, the one behind you.
Absolutely. And we don't usually have this particular conversation, but as we were preparing tonight, we were starting to talk a little bit about the time that you spent in Toronto after the war. And I wonder if you'd like to share a little bit about your time living there with this particular audience, which I think would love to hear about it.
Leaving Paris in 1946, more or less, no, I was not quite comfortable in Europe. And I had Stella, my first wife, had an uncle here in the country. So he became the only relative of hers that had survived and became sort of the logical aim and the final target. And one of the ways of getting into the United States with its very, very difficult immigration law, the McCarran Walter Act, made it necessary for me to wait 7, 8 years nearly to get to this country. And one of these places was Toronto. And arriving in Toronto, I was a typical immigrant. That is, no job, no money. That is pretty much a person without any means. And so my first job was my first effort was to find a home. And I found it, as somebody in your audience reminded me, it was on Young Street, way up on Young Street, in a home that was very nice, but had one room, spare room. That's where we lived. Not for too long a time, but eventually I found a job, and as officially, actually I was hired as a bookkeeper, though I know nothing about bookkeeping, and was in charge of payroll for employees. It was a place that sold automobile parts. They owned huge fields of used cars. And when somebody needed a car from a strange car, they found a car and took out the part. And the name of the company was Levi Auto Parts. It probably may not exist anymore, but then it was a thriving business. I stayed there for a comparatively short time as a officially paymaster. I never did that. I became an expert in safety. It seems that a lot of young men working out in the fields of cars, used cars, used to take a car apart by having them piled up. They just gave it a shove and it dropped down and fell apart. That is how they generated the used car parts. It was an interesting job for me. And most of the young men were from Newfoundland, at that time, a rather neglected area of Canada, actually then probably still an independent part, owned or run by the United Kingdom. And I learned a lot, but I advanced very quickly because most of these young men were sons of fishing people, of backward king people. I probably knew more English than they did, and probably knew how to write something that they did not know. So I advanced very, very quickly in the hierarchy, but eventually decided that I would come to the United States, and Toronto was one of my way stations, and I loved it. It was wonderful. It was very provincial for me because it was of a time before Canada was divided into French speaking and English speaking part. And at that time, Toronto was an, somewhat, I don't want to characterize it, an overgrown village, very nice. It had one art gallery on Brewer Street. And Toronto grew very, very quickly once Canada was divided. That is when businesses moved from Montreal to Toronto. But by then, I was here in the United States. So I participated in history, not just European history, just the history of Canada, a small part of it, but very interesting.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks for sharing that. And it sounded when we were talking earlier, like you enjoyed also canoeing while you were in Toronto, that was something you could.
Yes, I mentioned that Toronto was so small townish is a wrong word for it. So down to earth, I owned a canoe. And where did I store it? There was a raft out in the harbor. That's where I left the canoe. When there was time to go canoeing, I went out, there was a canoe. I understand that this would be difficult today, but then I just left it there without any qualms, any worries that it will get stolen or damaged. And so Toronto had a charm of its own, and I liked it.
Personally, I rent a kayak now because I find that, dragging my own around Boston is a little bit too much. Switching gears a little bit, Fred, you've probably done hundreds of interviews for magazines, newspapers, film, TV, radio. I know you appeared in a witness theater production, and you've recorded some of your own memories for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and for other organizations. Those were all shorter projects. They're articles, sound bites for documentaries. You've spoken about how both Stella, your first wife, and Rebecca, your current wife, have urged you to write an autobiography. And when I first approached you about this project, that's actually what I suggested, that I would help with your autobiography. But your counter proposal was that I write your biography instead. Can you talk about why and why me? Why was I the right person for this?
To write my story, everybody said, you have a story to tell, write it down. When I started to think about it, I realized that I really could not do it. To delve into that past at any serious depth was much too upsetting for me. And I would have to talk about things that bothered me then. And yes, the urge was there to tell the story. And I was then, and still am, quite involved, speaking to classes, to lectures. There were times when I was out several times a week talking to classes in this general area. And every now and then I was in the Bronx speaking to a class that was largely Hispanic or African American pupils. To them, I was a man from Mars. And I realized for me to tell the story, it would be quite beyond my emotional strength. Over the years, sharing Julia and her family in the synagogue, I found it comfortable to talk to them. Eventually, when Julia was quite young. Yes, I found it comfortable talking to her. And one day, when she asked me, could I write a story about you? I felt comfortable enough to say, yes, Julia, you may. And so she was the one that really wrote that book, Resilience, and dealing with a small section of my life out of the 70 odd years. It just deals with a very, very short segment and a very small part of my emotional experience, an important one. And I think that Julia deserves all the credit for telling the one story that I could not tell. And she does it superbly and with feeling and insight. Uh, how does one tell a story such as mine? And mine is just an average story of a survivor. Very, very lucky run. No brains, pure luck. When every 10th was shot, I was number 9. In a long march, I did not lose my boots or shoes to, to lag behind and to be shot. Yes, there are too many memories, and I didn't want to delve into them. So Julia does a superb job, and I owe her a lot of things. She did something that I wasn't ready to do.
Thank you, Fred. I just asked that question so that you'll compliment me. So thank you. I'm just gonna name something that's happening for me right now, folks. You were all wishing Mazel Tov to, I'm sorry, to one of the folks who's on tonight who has a new grandchild. I'm pleased to share that I'm pregnant, and though I'm well into my second trimester, still experiencing some morning sickness. So I have a candy in my mouth at the moment, and if I need to take a break in a minute, I'll ask that you all forgive me for that. But for the moment, I think we can keep continuing on. And Fred, I'd like to switch to talking a little bit about your creative process, if we can. Tell me a little about how you come up with new pieces and how you get started on them when you do.
The theme is always the same. It's a shower, only you cannot see it. I know where the connection is, and I avoid it consciously. Yes, there are very important themes, mostly based on the Tanakh in one way or another, but permuted with that overlay of memory. So the Kotel, Jerusalem, the imaginary temple is one of my important themes. We know fairly well what the Herodian temple looked like. Yes, it's one of my themes, but I'm not using it. There's one item in the temple that exists today, the wall, the kotel. And so one day I painted a memory, my interpretation of the kotel. Then I looked at it and said, well, there was something behind it. And in my imagination, I started to build up buildings of that kind that I thought would have been there. Eventually, I painted large buildings. I painted the imaginary temple. And before I knew it, I had added gates to the temple. That is, you enter the building through a gate, and gates became one of my subject matters. Yes, you see a picture of a gate. Oh, the origin was a totally different gate. I painted gates into a wall. That is, what started out as an execution wall had now gates and had the temple behind it. So there's a straight line in my mind from the very earliest image to what I'm doing to this day. Some of my paintings today still deal with the imaginary temple, interpreted totally and several times over. And I thank you, Julia, that you have given me the chance to talk about it. Otherwise, it's just another painting. as there are hundreds of them all over the place.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to turn it over to my dad to ask the next couple of questions, and I'll be off camera for a moment, but I'll be back.
Fred, one of the things I'm always fascinated when you talk about it is how you start a new canvas. Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, it's the scariest thing. You stand in front of a blank white canvas. And what I do, and I not do it always, but very often, I stand in front of a canvas, load a brush with paint, with my back to the canvas, reach back and move the brush. And something will stick to the canvas. Then I look around and say, well, what did I paint there? What did I intend to do? And I take it from there, when sort of the silence of the whiteness had been broken. And I can use that as a starting point. Yes, using my usual themes of the Shoah, of the temple, of the Tanakh, and take it from there.
And how do you know when a piece is done?
I never know. Most importantly, I don't know when it's finished. Very often I overwork the thing. So a painting is right when it feels right. Well, what are the ingredients? I don't know. It's my feelings. Technically, I'm very, very much aware of the quality of a painting. But every now and then I sort of take my nails and go like that and scratch a painting, and people go horrified, and I tell them you can't do that in a museum, but with my paintings you can do it. I'm very much a craftsman. I'm thinking of a person's home having a painting, and that painting being exposed to the life and to the elements. My paintings will last. So it's a crafts work.
And I'll just add on your behalf that when Fred talks about the craft, he starts with stretching his own canvas onto a frame that he builds. And he still does that today. And he mixes his own paints.
Yes.
We do have a question from Gail about how the drawings that you did in the camps survive, and how did you find them afterwards?
When I was shipped to Auschwitz, I had a box full of drawings of scenes in Theresienstadt, almost all of them in black and white. And the subject matter was Theresienstadt life, people standing around, the triple bunks, those things that one saw in a place like Theresienstadt. And I was a rank beginner. There was a man, Fritter, a distant relative, who was a well-known artist. I showed him once these drawings, and he said, if they find them on you, you're dead. And I was careful to hide these paintings. When I was shipped to Auschwitz, I had them in a box, and I gave that box was hidden underneath the floorboards. I gave them to my, but then not yet my wife, Stella. She was shipped to Auschwitz and left the drawings for somebody else. This happened once again. After the war, when I returned to Prague, I tried to find these drawings and couldn't find anything, and eventually gave up. In 1984, Rebecca reminded me recently, but it was more or less 84. She and I went to Kibbutz Givat Chaimichut in Israel, and where there were many survivors of Terezin. And I said, look, this is what happened to my drawings. Where do you think I could find them? And they said, well, we don't know, but we have a few things in our archives. We don't know whose they are. And sure enough, there were 4 drawings in there black ink, and you've seen one of them, the insane asylum. So my feeling is that yes, these drawings may survive and having been ascribed to somebody else, another artist, or scattered somewhere, and I really don't mind. These were records, drawings made there and then, so they're true evidence, and I don't really need them anymore. They're very much in my head, and other artists have dealt with it, some of them superbly.
I'm going to go in another direction, but you are actually sitting in your studio now, and we see one painting to your left, which is, I know from past discussion, is a recent one, and then there's one all the way behind you.
Yes, let me tell you.
And Brian has the picture of the studio with your paints. If you could put that up for a moment.
I don't know where Brian has, but you're looking
There
at
it
my studio. These are my paints. I mix my own colors. That is my own paints. And here are dry pigments lined up. I'm not sure whether you can read any of the text in there, but some of them going back a good while. There's some paint in there. I read the date, 1978. So I've been collecting paints, ingredients. Let me see the bell. There you are, January 73. And yes, I've been painting for a long lifetime. I'm 97 now. So there's a lot of stuff around the studio. Some of it's still quite useful. I think I have enough cadmium red, orange for a generation of painters. That is, I'm very much a craftsman. I try to do a good job, solid job, not just as painting, to live sensibly. And that expresses itself in many forms. One of them is the quality of my paintings. I try to make a good life, and a good painting, and be a sensible part of the community. Which gets me to the other subject. People ask me, what is your recommendation? It's very simple. Get involved. You cannot stand by and let things happen around you, particularly with younger people. I'm telling them what happened to me when I was very young, to my family, happened because people could not get involved, did not look right or left, and let somebody else do it. We have to be involved in the community, in the world, and in the world immediately around us. My idea then and today was, if in the 1930s, when I was young, enough people in Central Europe had cared enough what their community was doing, what it was doing to Jews, Jewish families, if they had stood up and said, this is not what we are for, do something about it, probably the community and I and my family and my larger family would have survived. As it is, I'm the only one left.
Thank you. Part of that question, though, was also about the painting that's right next to you on your left, that was in our screen, and someone asked you to talk about that, if you could.
One of the themes that I deal with is fire. That is flames. Obviously, coming out of Auschwitz, fire is very, very much a theme that I had to deal with, both in its positive and its negative. In this particular painting to my left, this one behind me, yes, there is fire, but it is not an illustration. It is a feeling about it. The color reproduced on the screen is probably too subtle. It is the actual color is deeper and more saturated. may convey better what my feelings were when I painted this, which is now a few years back. But I'm still painting and still using color and flames, light and dark, to tell what I feel like. If you go to my, put my name into the computer, then you'll find art, whole shows in it, and even some films about me, but mostly a lot more paintings. Now, my paintings are in many, many different places and collections. I don't know what is where. All I know is I'm very fortunate that people want to own them and have these paintings live with them. It's my way of sending out the memory that other people are skilled enough to put into writing, Julia being one of them. The paintings are my messengers to a future, a messenger of memory. And that is what I'm trying to convey. Remember, not me, but the world out of which these things had to have been created. Obviously, you can tell I can talk a mile a minute, and I should skip it.
And Julia, I'm going to ask you to answer one of the questions, which is about, do Fred and Rebecca have children, and are they interested in art? But particularly since Daniel helped you so much with the arts, preparing the art for the book, maybe you can address that.
Yeah, Fred and Rebecca have a son, Daniel, who is actually, he and I are quite close in age to each other. So we've known each other a long time, and he photographed all of the work that's included in the book, which includes actually the couple of photos that Brian just shared of Fred's studio and of Fred himself. And Daniel, I think, has really, particularly in the last 5, maybe 10 years, has taken over the management of Fred's art. So Daniel himself, he did these photographs because we asked him to, because we were creating this work together, and was very generous with his time. But his own photography is quite beautiful. And one of the things that's always captured me is that Fred's younger brother, Tommy, who died in the war, who died in a camp, was also a photographer. Specifically, he had started doing photography in his early teens, and that's something that Daniel has followed. But Daniel really has taken on ensuring that all of Fred's work is cataloged and kept so that it can be seen for future generations. So I would say he both has an interest in his own artwork, which I'm a big admirer of, but also in helping to maintain Fred's legacy and his artwork.
Thank you. Fred, you speak very often about the crazy bass that plays inside you and art being one of your fiddles to add harmony to your life. Where do the other arts, I know that you're passionate about music and other art forms. Can you address that in the context of your life?
Part of it started way before the war. My family lived close to a theater, an opera theater in Prague. Musicians, singers, music people moved constantly through the family. In fact, my grandparents had and I'm not sure whether it's a Wednesday or which day of the week it was, people would come with their instruments and sit around and play. Now, officially, it was chamber music, but they came to because her grandmother was a superb cook, and they ate and had goodies, cakes, and whatever, but music was part of it. To the point where I remember at one time somebody said, "You call that an interpretation?" The man who was spoken to said, "You talk, go, you do it, and show us what you think it should be." So music and interpretation was part of my early life and remained so. I was always member of opera groups, even after the war in Paris and in New York. I had subscriptions to chamber music and to operas. Music is very, very much part of my life. To this day, music and painting are keeping me alive.
Indeed. Julia, you and Fred worked on this for roughly 6 years, I happen to know. Can you address a little bit about how the book evolved over that time?
Absolutely. I think a couple of things really shifted over the course of that. I know we're talking to an international audience tonight, but I think it will be meaningful to this group to understand that when Fred and I started this project, it was under President Obama. And it was a really different feel for both of us and for the country than it was when we finished this project, which was under President Trump. Now, since then, things have shifted. But I think we both felt a sense of urgency that restarted when Trump was president, and a sense that this story really needed to be completed and be out so that people have the reminder to be watching, not just for ourselves, but for our neighbors, and to take care of one another. So that's some of the context that I think really shifted over the course of this. The thing that I think changed the most in the book itself was it took me a long time to admit that I'm part of this book, and that this was not the story of me and Fred, but the story of Fred telling me your story. And so recognizing that, you know, in my original draft, it was a straight telling of what I had heard. And I was often trying to sort of shoehorn opinions into things, usually in my interpretations of the artwork. And I had a very good editor who came back to me and said, "What's missing from this is your voice." And so it became a story that's told from me to the reader, which I think becomes important in the intergenerational aspect, and in the Devar we heard tonight. That was a piece of what you were speaking about, but also in the recognition that these are relationships between people, and that relationships between people is part of what keeps stories alive. And so I think those are some of the things that really shifted over the course of this project.
Fred, we have one more question for you, and then I'm going to give it back to Julia to do a closing reading, and then to Ellen. And Ellen, once you've given everybody the official good night, we're going to run a short video that people might want to watch as they sort of sign off. So we'll just leave it on for a minute after you're done. But Fred, the final question for you is, what is your favorite painting that you've painted?
Oh dear, the next one that I'm going to paint, the one I'm working on right now. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I know it will be as good a representation of what's going on inside of me. And I'm trying to be as truthful about that feeling as I can be, well aware that it contains memory. And you, the viewer, are the third part, the second part of it. I'm just a brush that does it. You, the viewer, are an interpreter. You are reading what I have painted.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor to hear you, Fred. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Julia.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for spending this evening with us, and Fred particularly for joining tonight, and for your faith in me to write this book at all, and to embark on this project together. And once again, a special thanks to the Sisterhood and to Ellen for hosting. If you haven't yet, you can still order Painting Resilience. The link is in the chat to the Amazon webpage. And just a reminder that all of my proceeds from this work will be going to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which holds the largest collection of Fred's work. I'm going to close with one of Fred's most famous quotes, which my dad started to share earlier, and do a short reading, and then I'll pass it back to Ellen. "The camps are a bass playing inside of me. It's always there. I've learned to play the fiddle over it, not because that drowns it out, but because it creates some harmony in my life. Art is one of my fiddles." It's not an uncommon sentiment for Holocaust survivors to believe their own survival was luck. Having heard his story in such great depth, I agree that Fred's physical survival is almost entirely coincidental, though arguably his certainty that he could survive and insistence on continued learning to plan for the future provided necessary mental and emotional fortitude. The memories of the war and the trauma he experienced never go away, despite his belief in the hospital bed following liberation that he would eventually be able to move on. The vestiges are still there more than 7 decades later. Fred keeps extra pairs of shoes in case emergency strikes. He freezes up in front of police officers, momentarily finding himself someplace where the appearance of a guard might mean torture or death. He somehow allows those moments to pass, pulling himself back into the present. He never learns to forget trauma. He learns to live with it, and even to create beauty out of it through his artwork. This left me with important questions that would not allow the book to end here, despite how much less vivid Fred's memories are after liberation. If living with is what takes skill, what are those skills? How does one develop their own internal fiddle to play over the ugly tune of traumatic memories that can never be escaped? Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. I will pass it back to Ellen to close us out.
No, thank you for, I don't even know what to say. Thank you for writing such a beautiful story. And I want to tell you, Fred, that I did put your name in my computer, and I did see a lot of your works, and I can't wait for my book to come. Anyways, I just was thinking before how interesting it is, because this pandemic that we're going through, and especially us in Ontario who are locked down, and we're feeling so sorry for ourselves because we have nowhere to go and we have nothing to do. And this really, what you live through certainly puts this into perspective, because we have nothing to do and nowhere to go, but we have a roof over our head and food to eat. And I guess it's not so bad what we're living through. I just want to, I'm so thrilled that Fred actually was part of our presentation, because that was a surprise until I found out that you were coming. And on behalf of all of us at Beth David Women, I just want to thank you for this beautiful story and your beautiful work, and for joining us this evening. And like I said, I can't wait for my book to come. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And when the borders open, come and visit us anytime.
Brian, let's go to the video.